I'm Shivan Chandna. This is World DNA, the show that gets you ahead of the rest.
And I'm Hem Kaur Saroya. And on the show today, a massive Russian drone strike targeted Ukraine's Kharkiv, hitting civilian infrastructure and residential areas, sparking multiple fires as Moscow and Kyiv, of course, trade blame for striking and endangering truce efforts. How will things pan out going forward? Ukraine's hope is that US President will push Russia for a truce. Whether that will happen or not, that's something that remains to be seen. We'll discuss that on the show today.
Also on World DNA, major updates have emerged from the US war chat leak incident. The Atlantic magazine, whose editor-in-chief was mistakenly added to the Signal group chat, has made public all the details of that chat. We'll bring you a timeline of the same on World DNA today. Let's start with the headlines.
And what we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
Donald Trump announces plans to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on foreign-made cars. Shares of Asian and US automakers fall after US President's announcement.
Hegseth is doing a great job. He had nothing to do with this. Hegseth. How do you bring Hegseth into it? He had nothing to do. Look, it's all a witch hunt.
US President backs his Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth amid a scandal over top security officials' use of a civilian messaging app to discuss military plans.
U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem in El Salvador to visit a mega prison holding the Venezuelans deported by the United States.
French President Macron says a proposed European armed force in Ukraine could respond to any future Russian attack after the ceasefire, ahead of a Paris summit to discuss the plans for such a force.
U.S. Central Command launches more strikes against Houthi targets across Yemen.
Brazil's former President Jair Bolsonaro to stand trial for allegedly orchestrating a military coup after the country's Supreme Court decided he should face criminal prosecution.
Muslim worshippers across the world offer prayers on the night of Destiny, one of the holiest nights during the fasting month of Ramzan.
Wall Street investment banks are bracing for more job cuts as deal-making slows amid economic uncertainty. Analysts warn that if deal activity doesn't rebound soon, deeper layoffs and bonus cuts are inevitable.
Arsenal produce a thrilling comeback to overturn a 2-goal deficit and beat Real Madrid 3-2 on aggregate in Women's Champions League. They will face record 8-time champions Olympique Lyonnais in the semi-finals. Now, massive Russian drone strike targeted Ukraine's Kharkiv, hitting civilian infrastructure and residential areas.
And this happened as Moscow and Kiev trade blame for strikes endangering their truce efforts. At least 4 fires broke out after the drone strike in Kharkiv, with the largest one engulfing an industrial building. Preliminary reports indicated that at least 9 people were injured, though the toll may rise. Emergency services, including firefighters, police, medics and utility crews, rushed to the scene, working to contain the damage and assist victims.
This as the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the United States will examine Russia's requested conditions for agreements with Ukraine, but cautioned that a peace deal will take time.
To end a war where people are dying. And I think everyone should be happy that the United States is engaged in a process of ending a war and bringing about peace. It's not going to be easy. It won't be simple. It'll take some time. But at least we're on that road and we're talking about these things. And we're going to test it and see what's possible.
Russia and Ukraine agreed in parallel separate talks with US envoys in Saudi Arabia to halt strikes in the Black Sea. But the Kremlin said that a revival of a deal on the Black Sea was subject to a number of conditions and that Russia was discussing sanctions relief with the US.
Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed hope that the US has enough power to press Russia into an unconditional ceasefire. At a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, Zelensky said sanctions against Russia should remain in place and be strengthened.
Let's hope and believe that the US has enough power to press Russian President Vladimir Putin into an unconditional ceasefire. Sanctions against Russia should remain in place and strengthen as long as the Russian occupation continues.
French President Emmanuel Macron renewed the call on Russia to accept a 30-day ceasefire without conditions and said that it was too early to consider lifting sanctions. He warned that Russia was still showing a desire for war despite efforts to forge a ceasefire.
In Jeddah, on March 11th, Ukraine clearly expressed its agreement to the United States for a complete ceasefire without preconditions for a period of 30 days, even though it is the one being victimized by aggression. We expect the same commitment from Russia.
Macron spoke after talks with Ukraine's president and ahead of a summit in Paris of some 30 nations on Thursday that will discuss the proposed European armed force for Ukraine that the French president suggested could be deployed in important towns and elsewhere to respond to a Russian attack.
Meanwhile, the UN called for more aid for Ukraine during a Security Council meeting, applauding separate agreements the US struck with Ukraine and Russia to pause their strikes in the Black Sea and against each other's energy targets.
The war must end. We must all continue to agree on this. The United States commends Ukraine and the Russian Federation for taking the first steps towards a ceasefire, including participating in technical level talks this week. We welcome the proposed partial ceasefires on strikes against energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea, agreed to in principle by the leaders of both sides.
Now, the UN and Turkey brokered the Black Sea Initiative between Russia and Ukraine in July 2022 to allow the safe export of Ukrainian grain. Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Initiative in July 2023, complaining that its food and fertilizer exports face serious obstacles. Now, for more on this, a correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York. Listen to this.
On Wednesday, here at the United Nations, the Security Council held an open briefing on the worsening humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya reported a sharp rise in civilian casualties and detailed severe violations against children in Russian-occupied areas. Meanwhile, diplomatic momentum is building after the United States brokered a maritime ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine to secure safe passage in the Black Sea and halt strikes on energy infrastructure. However, it appears that violations continue and Russia is tying the deal's implementation to sanctions relief, prompting criticism from President Zelensky of Ukraine. Council members broadly welcomed this ceasefire effort, but stressed that Ukraine should be involved on all future negotiations when it comes to its future or any peace talks. And they also demanded accountability for attacks on civilians. Now, media reports indicate that President Trump's administration is aiming to secure a full ceasefire by the 20th of April. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened to seize parts of Gaza if Hamas does not release the remaining hostages.
Now, the renewed threat comes amid intensifying protests against Hamas by Palestinians in Gaza. Take a look.
The fighting in Gaza continues. The more Hamas continues in its refusal to release our hostages, the more powerful the repression we exert will be. And I say to you, members of the Knesset, and I say it to Hamas as well, this includes seizing territory, and it includes other things that I'm not going to specify here.
In a video message, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has also warned Gaza residents of expansion of military operations, asking them to demand Hamas removal.
Residents of Gaza, the IDF will soon operate in force in additional areas of Gaza, and you will be required to evacuate for your own protection from the combat zones. The plans are already prepared and approved. Hamas is endangering your lives and will cause you to lose your homes and more territory that will be annexed to the Israeli defense system.
Katz asked residents to learn from protesters in Beit Leah in northern Gaza. The rare public show of opposition to Hamas has continued in Gaza for a second consecutive day, with demonstrators chanting slogans and calling for an end to the war. Another protest video from Shijaya also shows hundreds calling for the dismissal of Hamas, indicating the anti-Hamas protests may be spreading.
Now, the United Nations has said that the renewed Israeli operations have displaced 142,000 people in just 7 days. Israel's resumption of intense bombardment across Gaza has shattered weeks of relative calm brought by the truce. Just over a week since the IDF resumed operations after a ceasefire, Israel has said 2 projectiles were fired from Gaza, with one intercepted and the other landing near the border.
Now, the return to fighting has also led to mass protests in Israel demanding a return to negotiations to bring back the remaining hostages and bodies. Protesters rallied near Netanyahu's residence, calling for immediate elections.
Israelis also gathered near the parliament, demonstrating against a bill that would increase political influence over the appointment of judges. The measure could spark a new constitutional crisis and help the government enact policies that have drawn fierce criticism. Protesters beat drums and blew horns while waving flags, Israeli flags.
And nearby, Muslims gathered at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque to hold prayers overnight to mark Laylat al-Qadr. The worshippers crowded the narrow lanes leading to the mosque, which is home to the third holiest shrine for Muslims. For many of them, Laylat al-Qadr, or Night of Power, is an opportunity to enhance one's willpower and begin a journey of spiritual growth through prayers. Donald Trump has announced plans to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on cars from overseas.
Now, the US president says levies will take effect on the 2nd of April, when he is also expected to unveil reciprocal tariffs on other imports.
Going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff. We start off with a 2.5% base, which is what we were at, and we go to 25%.
Well, April 2nd is around the corner, and regarding the announcement surrounding April 2nd, Trump indicated the measures may not be the like-for-like levies he has been pledging to impose, the reciprocal tariffs. Listen to this.
We're going to make it all countries, and we're going to make it very lenient. I think people are going to be very surprised. It'll be, in many cases, less than the tariff that they've been charging us for decades.
Now, experts warn that these tariffs could drive costs of cars higher for consumers. And according to the Center for Automotive Research, the U.S. automotive industry relies heavily on imported parts. And the U.S. imported $474 billion worth of automotive products in 2024, including passenger cars worth $220 billion. The biggest suppliers include Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and Germany.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that new tariffs are a direct attack on his country and that the trade war is hurting Americans. Carney announced support for all in Canada auto manufacturing.
We will build an all-in Canada network for auto manufacturing components. Because on average, an auto part crosses that border, often through that bridge, over that bridge, 6 times before final assembly. And in a trade war, that's a huge vulnerability.
Now, Asian shares skidded with Wall Street. While the dollar climbed to a 3-week high after Trump's announcement, Japan's Nikkei fell 1.2%, while South Korea's Kospi dropped 0.9%. Shares in Japan's biggest car companies fell, with the world's top-selling automaker Toyota dropping 3.7%. Nissan shed 3.2% and Honda fell as much as 3.1%. Mitsubishi Motors was down 3.7%, and in South Korea, Hyundai shares dipped 3.4%.
US automakers also lost ground, with General Motors slumping 8%. Shares in Ford and US traded shares of Chrysler parent Stellantis fell about 4.5% each. Wall Street also ended sharply lower on expectations of such a move, with the tech-heavy Nasdaq slumping more than 2% overnight. And more details have emerged about the US war chat leak incident.
Right, and the Atlantic magazine, whose editor-in-chief was mistakenly added to the group of top officials, has made public all of the details of the chat, including the plans for US strikes in Yemen.
The Atlantic said that they are posting the chats after statements from senior leaders and intel chiefs, who all said in unison that there was no classified information in that chat. Now, the magazine declared that they are releasing the chat group communication in public interest. Let's take a look at the key messages and how the events unfolded in the chat. Now, there are several messages exchanged in the group, during which time the Atlantic editor-in-chief was already added to the chat. He was seeing all of this as it was being posted. As is visible from the screenshots of the chat, there are 19 members in the group. Jeffrey Goldberg was added by NSA Mike Waltz. The setting of the group can be seen as disappearing messages. Time was set for 1 week, and then we see the first message by Waltz after Goldberg was added to the group.
Now, the message says that the group has been established to coordinate on the Houthis for the next 72 hours. Now, this is where things get interesting. After a chat on other administrative issues and political messaging, there is a text from US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. The timing is 11:44 a.m. Eastern Time. Hegseth sends a long message of what the strike plan is going to be. Take note of the timing here. The text is sent out 2 hours before the first strike on the Houthis happened and 31 minutes before the first US warplanes were launched. The text reads, "Weather is favorable." Hegseth confirms the mission is a go. Then the text says that at 12:15 Eastern Time, the F-18s launched. At 1:45 Eastern Time, that is afternoon local time, the F-18 carries out its first strike. More details are then shared about the second strike that is supposed to take place, which is at 3:36 Eastern Time. In the end of this text, Hegseth says that more is to follow as per the timeline.
The US Defense Secretary ends the message with Godspeed to our warriors. To remind our viewers of the details of the alleged intel leak, on Monday, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine published an article about how he was added to a chat group on messenger app Signal. And in the first article, Jeffrey Goldberg had not included sensitive details of the US military's plan, but shared one screenshot which showed how top lawmakers were part of the chat group.
National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has taken responsibility of the incident and said that agencies are investigating the matter. However, questions are being raised by congressional lawmakers during the ongoing Intelligence Committee meetings that have overlapped with this intel lapse. Senators in the House of Representatives have grilled heads of intelligence agencies over the unprecedented lapse.
The US President, on his part, has said that information shared on messenger application Signal was not classified and that there was no need for Waltz to apologize.
That being said, US intel agencies are warning that China remains the top military and cyber threat to the United States.
And a new report says that Beijing is making steady but uneven progress on military capabilities that could be used to capture Taiwan. The report highlighted China's growing arsenal of hypersonic weapons, stealth aircraft, advanced submarines, and a stronger cyber warfare force. It also says that China seeks to displace the US as the world's leading AI power by 2030.
Russia, Iran and North Korea are also identified as major challenges, with Russia gaining combat experience from its war in Ukraine. The report warned of China's role in cyber threats, infrastructure attacks and space warfare, as well as its limited action against fentanyl chemical exports.
Meanwhile, the report also notes China's domestic challenges, from economic struggles to demographic imbalances that could impact its long-term stability. Peru is heading for presidential elections after years of political instability.
Now, in an address to the nation, country's President Dina Boluarte announced the elections will be held on the 12th of April, 2026.
I call for general elections for April 12, 2026, so that we can freely and democratically elect at the ballot box our next president, as well as the deputies and senators of the future bicameral Congress and representatives to the Andean Parliament.
The decision comes amid political crisis that has gripped Peru since 2019. Over the past 6 years, the country has had 6 different presidents. Incumbent President Dina Boluarte took over the presidency from Pedro Castillo in 2022 and has gone through 5 impeachment attempts since then.
Now, the fresh elections will also introduce a Congress in Peru after 3 decades. The Peruvian Congress will now include a 60-member chamber of senators.
This is alongside a 130-member chamber of deputies. Peru's elections come at a time when public outrage has surged against the ruling government over rising street violence in the country. President Boluarte declared emergency in the capital and deployed soldiers to help police address the violence. But despite the efforts to quell violence, Boluarte's popularity remains in trenches with 7% approval rating.
And South Korea is battling massive wildfires that have been raging for the last 4 days.
The government has promised to deploy all available national resources to fight the country's worst ever disaster. Firefighting efforts are underway in the southeastern city of Andong, where advancing flames have displaced over 27,000 people already. South Korea's Forest Service has confirmed at least 24 people have died. The displaced people have been shifted to shelter houses.
The intense wildfires were captured by a NASA satellite that show their spread in the country's southeastern region.
Forest Services also reported that a helicopter crashed during the firefighting efforts. The government has designated the affected areas as special disaster zones fanned by strong winds and dry weather. The fires have consumed over 15,000 hectares and razed entire neighborhoods. About 2,600 inmates from 4 prisons in the Cheongsong County have been shifted.
Now, the worst affected city of Andong is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Several other UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Haho Village and Byungsan Confucian Academy in Andong city are also under severe threat.
Wildfires have recently become more frequent and widespread in South Korea. Environmentalists, they cite climate change as the main reason for their frequent occurrences.
기후변화 특징 중에 하나니까 이런
One characteristic of climate change here is the rapid increase in temperature, prolonged dryness, and stronger winds. These factors are all dangerous in terms of wildfires. For this reason, wildfires in our country are bound to become more frequent, spread on a larger scale, and one additional factor is that our country has dense forests. This means there is a lot of fuel, so once a wildfire starts, there's a lot to burn.
그러니까 연료가 많은 거죠. 한번 나면 탈 게 많은 거죠.
And with that, it's time now for a short break.
Don't go anywhere. Him and I will be back with you on the other side of this break. This is World DNA. When we come back, the Supreme Court of India has stayed the Allahabad High Court's controversial order stating that grabbing breasts and breaking pajama string, they were not enough to charge an accused for rape or attempt to rape. That has been challenged, that has been stayed. We will be bringing you the full report on that side.
Now, Iran's currency, the rial, has fallen below the key psychological threshold of 1 million per US dollar, hitting a new record low. We'll get you all the details of this on the other side.
WION, India's global voice, the channel that brings you the biggest stories from across the world through India's lens. Now available in more than 190 countries worldwide. Because we believe that the world is one. Watch us in Africa, Europe, USA and Canada, South America, Asia Pacific, Middle East and North African regions. Also available on these digital platforms across the world. WION, World is One. From the bustling trading floors of Wall Street to the vibrant exchanges of Asian stock markets, WION breaks it down for you to make sense of what's happening. As we reveal the key factors behind events, strategic battles, and the game-changing business decisions that shape the world. We bring you all of this and more on World Business Watch.
Unlocking the future of finance.
Dive into the world of tokenization with me
as we yield the power of tokenization.
Discover the future of
ownership, where I decode, demystify tokenization for you.
Empowering the tokenized revolution.
Get ready to dive
for an in-depth look at tokenization.
Busting the myths around tokenization.
Catch me on Token Money Magnet.
Token Money Magnet.
Token Money Magnet.
Token Money Magnet.
Token Money Magnet only on WION.
The Earth is sending distress signals. Wildfires, droughts, and melting glaciers. Can we reverse the damage? Explore the harrowing effects of climate change. It's a wake-up call. Global emergency. Climate Tracker on WION World is One.
To bring the benefits of the Subhash Chandra Show to your educational institution, teachers and students, send an invitation to Juhi Jha at juhi@such.org.in.
Catch me on Token Money Magnet as I demystify tokenization for you, only on WION.
Welcome back, viewers. You're watching World DNA with Haim and I'm Shivan. Lots more to discuss on this side of the show. Let's start with the headlines.
And what we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
Donald Trump announces plans to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on foreign-made cars. Shares of Asian and U.S. automakers fall after U.S. President's announcement.
American officials indicate US will not treat India like China, Mexico and Canada on tariffs. Reports say the message was conveyed at a meeting in New Delhi to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement.
Hegseth is doing a great job. He had nothing to do with this. Hegseth. How do you bring Hegseth into it? He had nothing to do with it. Look, it's all a witch hunt.
U.S. President Donald Trump backs his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, amid a scandal over top security officials' use of a civilian messaging app to discuss military plans.
French President Emmanuel Macron says a proposed European armed force in Ukraine could respond to any future Russian attack after the ceasefire, ahead of a Paris summit to discuss plans for such a force.
Brazil's former President Jair Bolsonaro to stand trial for allegedly orchestrating a military coup after the country's Supreme Court decided he should face criminal prosecution.
Hundreds of Hindus flocked to the beaches on Indonesia's Bali island to participate in the sacred purification ritual called Milasti.
Muslim worshippers across the world offer prayers on the Night of Destiny, one of the holiest nights during the fasting month of Ramzan.
US tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminium lead to hundreds of job losses, with at least 200 workers impacted. Economists warn that more layoffs are likely as uncertainty over US trade policy continues to weigh on Canada's economy.
Arsenal produce a thrilling comeback to overturn a 2-goal deficit and beat Real Madrid 3-2 on aggregate in the Women's Champions League. They will face record 8-time champions Olympique Lyonnais in the semi-finals.
The Supreme Court of India has stayed the Allahabad High Court's controversial order which stated that grabbing breasts and breaking a pajama string is not enough to charge an accused with the offence of rape or attempt to rape.
Now, during the hearing, the bench of Justices B.R. Gavai and A.G. Masih said that the High Court judge who passed this order exhibited total insensitivity in handling the case.
The Supreme Court had taken suo motu cognizance of the issue after senior advocate Shobha Gupta, through the organisation We the Women of India, brought to the notice of the Chief Justice of India to the order of the Allahabad High Court. The apex court order stated, "We are at pain to state that it shows total lack of sensitivity on the part of the author of the judgment. It was not even at the spur of the moment and was delivered 4 months after reserving the same." The apex court stayed the order and also issued notices to the centre, state of Uttar Pradesh and the parties in the matter before the High Court.
Now, this case involved two men, Pawan and Akash, who allegedly grabbed the minor's breast, tore her pajama and attempted to drag her under a culvert while she was walking with her mother.
Now, in the March 17th order, the Allahabad High Court judge ruled that these actions did not amount to rape or an attempt to rape, adding that these actions come under the prima facie offences of aggravated sexual assault. A trial court had earlier termed these actions as an alleged attempt to commit penetrative sexual assault on the minor.
And a Japanese man wrongly convicted of murder has been awarded a historic $1.45 million in a compensation.
Iwao Hakamada, now 89 years old, was acquitted of a 1966 quadruple murder. The payout represents $83 for each of the over 4 decades that he spent in detention.
Now, Hakamada, a former boxer, was awarded 12,500 yen, that's equivalent to $83 for each day of the 46 years that he spent in detention, most of it on the death row. Hakamada was released last year after his conviction for the murder of his former employer, his wife and their 2 children.
Iwao Hakamada's legal team said on Tuesday that the compensation payment ordered by the court was the highest ever criminal compensation granted in Japan. Following a tireless campaign by his sister and others, a Japanese court ruled that the police had tampered with the evidence and overturned Hakamada's conviction. He had initially confessed to the crime but retracted the confession during his first trial, claiming to have been abused during the 20 days of his interrogation.
Now, according to the Japanese public broadcaster NHK, Hakamada, once the world's longest-serving death row inmate, was acquitted after a DNA test showed the blood-stained clothing used to convict him was planted long after the murders took place. His case brought global scrutiny on Japan's criminal justice system. And according to Japan's Ministry of Justice website, conviction rates stand at 99%, that fueled calls to abolish the death penalty in the country.
Even after Hakamada's acquittal, the country's justice minister said last October that abolishing the death penalty would be inappropriate even after Hakamada's acquittal. Hakamada was the 5th death row inmate granted a retrial in Japan's post-war history. All 4 previous cases also resulted in exonerations. Hakamada now lives with his sister with help from supporters. In a boost to South Africa's cannabis industry, the government has lifted the ban on the product as well as hemp-derived foodstuffs.
Now, the decision reverses its earlier prohibition that had made it a criminal offence to engage in any commercial activity related to cannabis food items.
President Ramaphosa reaffirmed his support for more stakeholder input and public participation on new rules to reduce negative impact of cannabis and hemp-containing foods. The Ramaphosa government had been earlier criticized for its decision to ban cannabis, and many called it a legal absurdity, violations of rights and a disregard for the judgment of the Constitutional Court. The ban had deepened uncertainty over new regulations that they said undermined South Africa's economic stability.
The legal landscape around cannabis in South Africa has been a complex issue in 2018. The Constitutional Court decriminalized the private and personal use of cannabis. Last year, in 2024, South Africa legalized the cultivation and possession of the plant for personal use, becoming the first African country to do so. All this changed a few days ago when, in an about turn, the Ramaphosa government announced a crackdown on cannabis and once again criminalized the industry. Now, with the ban being reversed, the commercial activity related to cannabis food items has resumed in the country.
Looking to shore up its revenues, the cash-strapped South African economy is expected to benefit from the growth and innovation in the sector that is likely to follow the lifting of the ban.
Now, US investment banks are bracing for deeper job cuts as economic uncertainty weighs on deal making.
Banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan and Bank of America have already started trimming staff, with further layoffs expected if deal activity doesn't pick up.
Now, the downturn is reflected in investment banking fee, which fell 6.3% last year. The slowdown extends to equity offerings, with IPO issuance dropping to $57 billion from $69 billion in the same period last year. Analysts say large banks are leading the layoffs, with boutique firms likely to follow if deal flow remains weak. Recruiters warn that if conditions do not improve by mid-year, banks will be forced to make deeper staffing cuts.
Market uncertainty fueled by US tariffs and economic slowdown fears has dampened corporate confidence. Bankers say companies are reluctant to go public amid concerns over stock performance post-IPO. The slowdown threatens Wall Street's 2025 bonus pools. Meanwhile, bank stocks have taken a hit, with smaller firms suffering the most. US brokerage Oppenheimer has now revised its investment banking revenue growth forecast to 0%, a sharp reversal from its previous estimate of 32%. If deal activity remains weak, banks will need to cut costs through headcount reductions and lower compensation.
As banks navigate a challenging environment, staffing decisions will depend on deal pipelines in the coming months. Recruiters note that firms are assessing whether to staff up for growth or run leaner operations. Certain sectors like private credit and technology continue to show strength. However, consumer, industrial and construction-related businesses are expected to struggle.
Goldman Sachs has maintained that recent job cuts are part of its routine annual review process, with Wall Street bonuses, hiring and overall growth at risk. All eyes are on deal activity in the second half of the year. And Iran's currency, the rial, has fallen below the key psychological threshold of 1 million per US dollar.
Of course, this is a new record low. The steep decline follows 4 rounds of US sanctions on Iran's oil exports since President Donald Trump's return to the Oval Office. This has serious consequences for the economy as well as the people, of course. A weaker rial means imports become more expensive, pushing up prices for essential goods like food, medicine and fuel. With inflation already at 40%, many Iranians are struggling to afford basic necessities. Citizens are finding refuge in gold, dollars and other hard currencies.
The rial's value has more than halved since President Masoud Pezeshkian took office last year, reflecting deepening economic distress for Iran. The latest round of sanctions continues to restrict Iran's access to foreign currency and oil revenue, worsening market confidence. Despite these economic headwinds, Iranian officials, they insist that they are prepared to withstand external pressure, dismissing US calls for fresh negotiations. The diplomatic standoff between the US and Iran has fueled market instability.
Now, President Trump recently warned Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei that Iran's nuclear program could face either negotiations or military action. Iran's leadership, however, has rejected talks, calling them a deception.
With no resolution in sight, concerns over potential conflict persist. Meanwhile, investors and ordinary Iranians continue to offload the rial, fearing further depreciation. As tensions escalate, Iran's economic outlook remains fragile, with the currency's downward spiral showing no signs of reversal.
All right, let's now take a look at developments from the world of technology. The Vietnamese government has approved a trial launch of Starlink internet service in the country. The government said that the trial will extend until the end of 2030. Allowing the US firm to launch its internet service is seen by some analysts as one of the measures the Southeast Asian industrial hub has taken to avoid being hit with US tariffs. It's not yet clear if SpaceX has applied for a license to launch its service to Vietnam. The government's official statement said that the company is allowed to provide fixed and mobile service plans throughout Vietnam, including services on flights. However, the Vietnamese government has capped the trial's subscriber count at 600,000.
According to Yahoo News and YouGov poll, around 67% of Americans say they would not consider buying or leasing a Tesla. And the reason? Tesla CEO himself, Elon Musk. Around 30% respondents said that Musk was the sole reason, while 26% said he was a contributing factor. The poll was conducted between March 20th and 24th. Around 1,600 US adults were part of the survey. The result indicates a dramatic decline in Elon Musk's popularity since November. Tesla has been facing growing backlash due to Musk's political ties. In the US, incidents of Tesla facilities getting vandalized and Cybertruck owners facing public harassment have been reported. Moreover, a movement called Tesla Takedown is also gaining momentum, urging consumers to boycott the brand completely. Defending champions Kolkata Knight Riders are off the mark in the Indian Premier League.
Now, Quinton de Kock led the charge with an unbeaten 97 as KKR beat Rajasthan Royals by 8 wickets. Rajasthan Royals were the surprise winners of the inaugural edition of the IPL. Since then, they've blown hot and cold. Their performance in the 18th season of the IPL has been somewhat similar.
They piled up 242 runs in their opener against Sunrisers Hyderabad, albeit in a losing case. Against defending champions Kolkata Knight Riders in Guwahati, their batters struggled. Only 5 players reached double figures, with Dhruv Jurel top scoring with 33. The Royals set a modest target of 152 for Kolkata. Quinton de Kock had a forgettable Kolkata debut on Saturday, but he made amends against the Royals. The South African timed his innings perfectly against the likes of Jofra Archer and Vanindu Hasaranga. He reached his 50 and 35 balls and stayed unbeaten on 97 of 61. He hit 8 fours and 6 sixes and was named player of the match. Kolkata skipper Ajinkya Rahane and Angrish Raghuvanshi chipped in with important runs as KKR chased down the